Hey folks, David Stewart here. It's time for some more Storycraft. Today we're going to be talking about the evil teacher, which is a trope or a cliche for a villain type, really an archetypical presentation of a villain. Very common in the 20th century all the way up to today for reasons I will explain in a minute, and it's particularly resonant with a couple of generations, namely Generation X and Generation Y, of which I am a part. So the evil teacher is a teacher who is evil. It's an antagonist in a story, usually with a child protagonist. And the evil teacher is someone who's sadistic, someone who seems to hate children, someone who treats children unfairly or cruelly, does things that would be very unloving towards kids. And I think it's a very effective villain type for many reasons. One of the foremost is it's an inversion of the ideal relationship between a teacher and a student. A teacher and a student, or a master and a pupil, it's supposed to be a loving and caring relationship. The master should be looking out for the student. The master should be approaching that child with love and care to help that child grow, prosper, and stay safe. And the evil teacher is an inversion of that. This is a teacher who hates the child. This is a teacher who wants to cause the child pain. This is a teacher who does not look at the child with loving eyes, but rather with sadistic eyes, looks at the child as an opportunity to fulfill their own needs rather than to help the child. So it's an inversion of what we would consider the ideal teaching relationship. There are many books that use this. Some of the most common are the Roald Dahl books with characters like the Trunchbull, who is this evil school principal who hates children, swings them around by the hair and throws them out. And Roald Dahl does a great job of using these kinds of villains. He has evil parents and evil teachers. The evil teacher in a lot of ways is like the evil stepmother, sort of villain archetype, I guess, but really in a little bit different presentation because it's in a school, but it functions in a lot of the same ways. And maybe I'll do a separate video just on evil stepmoms that we see so much in fairy tales. But the Trunchbull does these horrible things to kids. Well, why don't the kids tell their parents? It's because their parents wouldn't believe them. It's too outlandish. And that really represents the heart of why the evil teacher is effective, is that a child is helpless when they are in school. They are at the whims of the adults that are around them. And this is true always. This is why Roald Dahl always makes the villains adults. Children are always operating at the whims of the adults. That is, the adults are always controlling everything about what the child is doing, their opportunities, and the child is helpless. So if the adult is good, then it's a very good relationship and the child is happy. And if the adult is bad, there's really no escape for the child. There's no one else. If your mom or dad is bad to you, who do you go to? And if your teacher's bad to you, do you go to your parents? Well, certainly in past generations, including my generation, you felt like you couldn't go to your parents, that your parents were not going to be on your side with any kind of school conflict. So you feel really helpless at school. And that resonates a lot with kids. So you see this a lot in children's literature. The adult is the bad guy, the kid is the protagonist. But even as adults, I think that resonates because we remember being children. We remember being in school. We remember being subject to rules that were unfair. We remember being subject to adults who treated us unfairly, who treated us cruelly, who wanted to do bad things to us seemingly for their own purposes, or were fulfilling, let's say, strange emotional needs by being a teacher, and that didn't include helping the children. So there's a comic that actually has been floating around. I remember it from a couple of years ago, and because a lot of my friends are teachers, they liked this comic without really thinking deeper about what the comic was representing unintentionally from the artist. So I can't find it right now, but in one panel, it's got a couple of angry parents holding up grades, like bad grades, they say like F, to the student and saying, explain these grades. And it's like parents then. That was parents then. The next panel is parents now, and they're holding that up to the teacher and saying, explain these grades. Well, what happened between these two generations of parents? Well, I have to think that this is one of those boomer comics that, baby boomers remember parents being on their side when they started teaching, and then now when they're older, the parents are on the kids' side. What's that about? Well, the parents now are the first students that you taught. And so they grew up with evil teachers. So of course they're going to look first at the teacher and think, well, is the teacher performing his duties? I want to hold the teacher accountable. Is the teacher being bad to my students because they understand, or being bad to my children because they understand that their children are away from them and their protection when they're in the public school system. They're away from them, they are unreachable, and you are trusting the teacher and the administration and the school staff to treat that kid with proper love and respect. So that's the first thing, is my kid actually being treated with love and respect? There's lots of concern about bullying and stuff like that in the school environment. And this is from students, or this is from parents who were students back in the 1980s and the 1970s who remember how bad it was. So Gen X, Gen Y, the reason that this sort of trope, I guess, resonates with us even into adulthood is that we grew up with bad teachers. Almost everyone's had at least one bad teacher, but a lot of us had really bad school situations. I had teachers like yell at me because I couldn't understand them, because I had hearing loss, right? So teachers getting angry that you are, quote, not paying attention to them when you literally can't understand the words coming out of their mouth. But this was a really common thing for lots of kids. I had kids who got in trouble, or I had friends who got in trouble because they could see the instructions on the board, like they needed glasses or something. And the teachers didn't think, well, maybe you can't see, or like, why can't you understand these instructions? Let's solve this problem. They're like, you're not paying attention and you're bad. That's so all these unfair situations we grew up with. Every kid has had, unfair situations like that. So that's why these tropes are very resonant as adults. There are many great examples of this. I mentioned Roald Dahl uses it. There's like the evil principal in Ferris Bueller's Day Off trying to stop Ferris from having a good time, really wanting Ferris to be a system-loving boomer like himself. But I think one of the best contemporary examples is actually the fifth Harry Potter book, Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, where the primary antagonist, Dolores Umbridge, is a teacher. She's not even really a teacher. She's a bureaucratic busybody sent by the state in order to disrupt and watch over the educational experience of Hogwarts. Now, Rowling actually uses the evil teacher trope even in the first book in Snape. But Snape is just sort of a minor antagonist. He's a bother to Harry. He's there to as a little bit of a disruption to the normal, like, Hogwarts is great and I love my educational experience, except for this one teacher who treats me badly. But Dolores Umbridge is on another level. She is truly the antagonist of the fifth book. Voldemort is just kind of in the background, right? And he's in the background for most of the books. He's kind of hovering out, waiting to be confronted in the seventh book. He actually does show up at the very end of the fifth book after we overcome the villainy of Dolores Umbridge. But Dolores is the main villain, and she's such an effective villain. She's probably the most effective villain of the entire series because of that evil teacher situation. Harry is helpless against her. The other teachers, like, he goes to Professor McGonagall and she doesn't help him. She tells him to keep his head down because this person's from the ministry. She can't help. There's no one to help Harry. Harry is helpless. So we go back to Harry basically from the first book, where he begins and he's living under the stairs with bad parents, just like we get in a Roald Dahl book. Very effective. They have abusive parents. Even though they're his, aunt and uncle, they serve the role of parent. Like the evil stepmother, it's the evil stepmother trope, which I could do a whole video, I guess, on the evil stepmother some other time. But, it's going back to that situation. You're utterly helpless. You're completely at the whims of the adults in your life. And this person happens to hate you and want you dead. This person wants to torture you. She makes him do actual torturous things for detention, not merely things that are annoying, not merely punishments to waste your time, but things that are physically painful, like actual torture. So she's a sadistic person, and she acts sadistically towards Harry Potter and really all the other children as well. Anything good that they want out of their educational experience, she disrupts. She gets him kicked off the Quidditch team. She doesn't teach the subject that everybody wants to learn, which is Defense Against the Dark Arts. She specifically avoids teaching it. So she's not only an evil teacher, she's also just a bad teacher as well. And she's stopping Harry from contacting the other adults in his life, like Sirius Black. So she's this all-consuming void of creating a helpless environment for Harry Potter. That's why it's so effective, is that the protagonist, Harry, is trying to figure out these things about, like, why does my scar hurt? Why am I having visions of Voldemort? And Dolores Umbridge is completely stopping him from doing that. She's the main antagonist, and also stopping him from doing anything else in the educational experience. That's why she's such an effective villain, really the most effective villain of the entire series, and I think a really good contemporary presentation of this. Now, the reason that you don't see this trope before the 20th century is that the 20th century is when we start to get compulsory schooling. Compulsory schooling in terms of, overall society is a very new and novel phenomenon. That is, everybody has to go to school. This wasn't the case prior to the 20th century, except, it was the case in some places, but it was not nearly as universal. 20th century is when we get universal compulsory schooling. And as is true with most government bureaucracies, it takes a while for the bureaucratic rot to really set in and destroy the purpose of the bureaucracy to begin with. So baby boomers, my parents, they grew up with an educational system that was still mostly intact, taught by teachers who wanted to teach kids their subject, who cared about outcomes, who cared about standards. They cared about this stuff really innately without any kind of tests being brought in from the outside to make sure they were actually teaching kids. They actually cared about educational outcomes for their own sakes. And so they grew up and put their kids in public school really with the assumption that the system would be working the same. But of course, by the 1980s, things were working very differently than they had in the past. The main reason we have standardized testing and all of this sort of stuff is that there was a general understanding that the educational standards had dropped. That is to say that kids were graduating without knowing anything. So you have a test that confirms or denies that. You start bringing accountability into teachers because it becomes obvious that many of them are not doing their job according to the standards that you would think they would want to be able to do this job. So Gen X, Gen Y, we grew up with a really failed institution full of bad teachers, and that's why it's resonant with us. And the reason you don't see it prior to the 20th century is that there simply was no public school was not a universal experience. Schooling was not a universal experience prior to the 20th century. But you see it a lot in literature in the 20th century onward, because then it becomes a universal experience. Everybody's been to school. Everybody's had a bad teacher. Everybody's felt helpless. Everybody's felt like there was a teacher or an administrator out to get them. Everybody's felt like the system didn't care about them. Everybody's had these feelings because everybody's experienced public school. It's like a touchstone of the cultural experience. And that's why I think it's really effective. And it's probably a really interesting and good trope to continue using, especially if you have a child protagonist. There's even hints of it like in Ender's Game and sci-fi novels like that, where you bring this relationship forward even into the future, where there's still going to be these same issues with an arrangement of where you take all the kids and put them in front of an adult. So anyway, that's that. That's The Evil Teacher. Leave me your thoughts down below as to what you think about it. Have you had an evil teacher? What's your favorite book with an evil teacher? There are so many that use this trope. It's hard to isolate one down, but I think one of the best contemporary examples is actually from a Harry Potter book. It's Harry Potter 5. And one of the reasons that I think that book is so effective is the very effective villain of Dolores Umbridge, the evil bureaucratic busybody sent from the state to disrupt everything, who makes the children helpless against all the things that they're trying to do, and isolates them from all the people in their life who care about them, their parents and everybody else. So I've dealt with some of this in my book, Eyes in the Walls, by the way. I should pop up the cover. Read Eyes in the Walls. It's very much about childhood isolation. And there's no bad teachers necessarily, but it does have that feeling that like the child is helpless and can't rely on any adults to actually save him, which I think is why the school experience as a setting is so effective. So anyway, let me know what you think, and I'll talk to you guys next time. The newest book is called it's called Afterglow, Generation Y. Again, it's in another room where I hold up the cover. So please check that out, and you've probably heard most of the stories from that. They've been on the channel. I've done audiobook versions of those stories, so you can drop a review on it right now, I guess, if you wanted to. But go ahead and grab the book. It's a collection of all of them. And the other new one is Ultrafalva. That's the tragic fantasy story. So check those out, and I will see you guys next time. Have a great one.